Hi, Misha here, and yet again it's late, or rather early, and doing another Blackbox video, although I hope to make this one shorter than last couple because I am tired, but I wanted to make this because of the date, September 11th, 2020. 20 years ago, I was living my life as a young adult. I'd moved out of home a couple of years before and was in college, still living in the dorms. Yeah, still would have been living in the dorms. And life was pretty good, mostly because sobriety was not all that common of an effect. And 19 years ago, the terrorist attacks happened, and while I can't say it had a huge dramatic shift on my life personally, it changed things in a fundamental way. And living through that, in my age and everything, was certainly an experience. At that time, I was living in my first apartment, had been there a bit, living with a girlfriend I'd had for a while at that time, and yeah, just trying to finish college, which I did, and moved on with life. It's crazy to think 20 and 19 years ago, and there are just those events, some positive, some negative, maybe some neutral, that you kind of remember where you were at. I would say prior to this, the Berlin Wall coming down and being on TV, and then of course the subsequent full collapse of the Soviet Union, but really the Berlin Wall was the major one, and that was generally a positive event for Americans in the West. Not so positive for Russia in the East, because Russia, it was tough times in the 90s, but that's a story for another video. For my parents' generation, you could say 1963, the Kennedy assassination, but on the other hand, they also had 1969, the moon landing. And for my grandparents' generation, you could say 1929, the stock market collapse, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Again, America specifically. And then 1945, the dropping of the atomic bombs, and the VJ Day, the end of World War II. We can just kind of roll those up into one, even though it's spread out over about a 2-week time period. And on you can go back. And it's really interesting, because with those events, something changes in the character of this nation. Like a major life event in anyone's person's life. Turning 18, getting married, perhaps getting divorced, having your first child, or maybe losing your first child. I mean, these things that shape us, that are part of the tapestry of life. And it's just the passage of time, but the generation, I guess most would call millennials, or maybe post-millennials now, whatever they're called, grew up in this world where 9/11 was a historical event. And therefore they grew up in a fundamentally different world than I did. I was born into the Cold War world. I remember in the 80s thinking about that. Heck, I remember when Rocky IV came out. And of course, the original Red Dawn. We shall not speak of the remake. Things of that nature. And then in 1991, it was a good year for America in general terms. The economy was doing well. The Gulf War was quick, decisive, and loss of life was minimized on both sides, not just American, but Iraqi too, although obviously more on the Allies. And that was very important because it restored something. Obviously, Vietnam had left some scars, and even Grenada had some. Even though it was, I guess technically you could say a success, it didn't really go off without a hitch, if you know what I mean. And so, the first Gulf War was a decisive military triumph for a nation that really hadn't felt it had one since World War II, if you think about it. I mean, the Korean War was... Anyway. So that's how World 91 kicked off. And like I said, then between August and December, you see the disillusionment of the USSR. And thus, we rolled into 1992, essentially telling ourselves, and with some justification, of course, we had won the Cold War. Something that had been going on since before the majority of people's birth. Then, of course, we roll into the election in 92. We get old Slick Willie. Although after his apology for Monica Lewinsky, we all started calling him Sweet William. And being here in Arkansas, you trust me, the jokes flew. I'm not saying the 90s were all roses. Of course not. There were major bad events. You had bombings. You had the Columbine incident. So on and so forth. But, as a general rule, the economy was on the upswing. And you started to have the internet, much I think all of us right now are grateful for. And then, of course, you had the dot-com bubble towards the end of the decade, which had not burst yet. So the decade went out on a high note. And I used to joke that in 1998, if the biggest thing they had to worry about was who was sucking the president off, well, it must have been a slow news day. So rolling into 2000, of course, we all had hella parties between 99 and 2000 New Year. I mean, that was, I think, for a lot of us, one for the ages. Yeah, good times. And then rolling into the year 2000, hey, we're in a new millennium. I was a young adult then. Could go places, went to some concerts with friends. Was in college by that time. And things were good. And things continued to be good for the majority of us until September 11th. And I think that's when, for the average American person, they realized they'd been enjoying a 10-year honeymoon, and that there were still real problems in the world, and people out there that truly, vehemently hated us. I'm not saying right or wrong, I'm not getting into that, I'm just saying it was a splash of cold water, because between 91 and 2001, most Americans were reasonably secure. Now, there were, again, problems, I know. I don't want to keep having to repeat that. But compared to what we've had since then, life was more secure. Wages were more fair. The middle class was more stable. Healthcare was more affordable. But, of course, the seeds of what we're reaping were already sown. Again, topic for another video. So, that day, in the morning, again, living with a girlfriend, she worked, not the night shift, but like second shift, getting off work about 12 o'clock. But I had class that morning at around 9 o'clock. So she was still in bed. She usually slept till, noon or so. I got up, we got dressed, took my guide dog at the time named Brandy. And we caught the bus down at the stop. There was a bus stop in front of the local grocery store. So usually on on the way home, as we got off the bus, run in the grocery store, go to the deli and get a sandwich or some chicken, and then walk home. Anyway, it was a business as usual type day. And my first class that day was some kind of English or literature class. I don't remember the exact one now, but And when I got on the bus, the first plane had just hit. But of course, no one knew what was going on. And at that time, people thought it was just a tragic accident. At least the people on the bus. And trust me, the bus driver, who I was friends with, at least, passing acquaintance, would have been happy to jump on any conspiracy. He was that type of person. Very amusing to talk to. Anyway, even he was like, it's just, tragic thing. And then while we were on the bus, that's when the second one hit, and everything changed. Instantly. Went ahead and went to class, because, what else are you going to do? You kind of just go into autopilot when you're processing something like that. Went in, and of course, we didn't have class that day. The teacher just asked everyone to kind of just do a writing assignment about their feelings, suggestions, just kind of freestyle to give everyone an outlet, and then we were allowed to either hang out and, converse with each other, because being in a large university, which I was, everyone had family and friends around the country, some in New York. And for me, I had been in New York getting my guide dog in '99, and in New York City and on Long Island. And so while I didn't have friends directly there, I'd been to that area and knew it, or at least in passing. And I remember part of my writing assignment was, I was just saying, this is probably what we'll do next. We'll invade, pretty much what I thought we would do as a nation is exactly what we did. And from there, Afghanistan, and a year and a half later, in March 2003, we went back to Iraq. And we had, of course, the Patriot Act, which was hugely controversial, rightfully so, at that time. And that's when America, at least my generation, but I think even my parents' generation to some extent, lost a lot of innocence. And the good times just seemed to be over. And I don't know. It just fundamentally changed things. The essence seemed to change. At least from my perspective. I just was just sharing my thoughts on this day. Yeah, you have your own, and I'd love to discuss them. Again, this isn't really telling you anything. I'm just sharing my opinion. And then, of course, we roll through the 2004 election. Bush, to some people's surprise, wins re-election. But to be honest, Kerry was such a weak contender. And then, of course, 2005, you had Katrina, which, and then all the fallout from that. And then, of course, the following year, the Democrats would surge in Congress. And then you start all this bailout stuff, bailing out American corporations, and that's something I do have strong feelings on. Because the corporations, to me, held American jobs hostage. Basically saying, you can't let us go under, because if you do, these people will lose their job, and think about all the people that buy our products, and so the government gave them money. And what's really despicable is most of the time these corporations have found ways to either pay low taxes or no taxes, and they still manage to lay off most of their American workers, oftentimes either going to automation or just sending jobs overseas to like India and other call center places. And it's funny, we live in a world where people act like socialism is a bad word. But somehow, most people seem okay with, or just oblivious to, corporate socialism. Why is it not okay to provide an individual citizen with money when they ask for it, but it is okay to provide a giant multi-billion-dollar corporation with money when they've bungled their own finances. Of the two, if you're going to be socialist, obviously the moral choice is to be it with people, but of course the political choice is to be with corporations because money. You know, I'm not naive. I'm not an idealist. I know exactly why it happens, but I'm just saying it shouldn't happen. Corporations, if they succeed and make profits, great. They should be able to reap the rewards. But equally, if they bungle what they've been doing, if they fuck up, sink or swim, bitches. The thing is, if that corporation goes under, their assets will be bought by another one. And even if people lose their job, they'll find other jobs. I mean, it's better to have a job at a prosperous, well-run company than it is to have a job at a company that is struggling to make ends meet and actually has to ask Uncle Sugar for a welfare check. Guess which one of those corporations is going to treat their employees with dignity and respect and give them pay raises, and which is going to do the bare minimum to keep their workers. And that's what we're seeing now, is the disparity between lower and upper classes, the stripping of the middle class and the shrinking of it. We're seeing wages that have stagnated over the past 20 years nearly. We're seeing more and more jobs outside of America. We're seeing a military that is receiving huge... They're not even receiving a piece of the taxpayer pie. They're basically getting the whole pie to themselves. And it all really kind of, if not got started, again, the seeds were planted long before, but 9/11 was the kick that really showed the rot and the foundation of this country. And I think that needs to be said right now. America is in trouble. It is rotten to the core. At least the government is. Argue with me. How many people on the left or the right think that the federal government has been doing a great job, is filled with competent, caring, and intelligent people, is protecting its citizens, and is just efficiently and well run? I think that's one thing we can both agree, at least as voters, be it on the left or the right. The government is not properly run. And honestly, I think we can also both agree that we should not have a ruling class. And I'm sorry, anyone who's been in politics, in Congress, or in D.C., however you want to say it, in a position there for 20 or more years, they are a ruling class member. Well, I'm actually a very non-violent person, which is kind of, I don't know, I think some people think that gun dealers, gun owners are these just rip-roaring commando, you know, soldier of fortune, soldier of fortune types. I'm not. I'm actually very pacifist for the most part. But, you know, America has problems, and we're not the good guys that we make ourselves out to be, at least some of us do. We've done selfish things around the world since World War II, and we've done a few downright evil things. We need to take a cold, hard look at ourselves. Doesn't mean we hurt ourselves. I don't believe in that either. You can admit your faults, not to abuse yourself, not to hate yourself, but to look at your faults to fix them. Because even the worst person out there is, at least in theory, redeemable. And I don't feel that America is necessarily evil, but we're not the beacon on the hill, the shining city, the example. The truth is, we're no better, we're no worse than a lot of other nations that have ever existed. But the sad part is, we really could be so much better than what we are. We really could be, but it's not easy. But nothing in life worth doing is easy. But, as I've said in other videos, I actually believe in the American citizens and the Constitution. I believe in the foundations of this country very strongly. It is excellent we have the Bill of Rights, that we have our guaranteed freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to bear arms, right to a just and speedy trial, what have you. But the current government that we've had, the system that's been growing really since World War II, has become more and more corrupt and more self-interested and more idiotic. You have people in D.C. making decisions, not thinking about the long-term consequences, not considering the long-term costs. Heck, sometimes their decisions aren't even considering the cost 6 months from now. With the elections coming up, I wish we as the people would take this nation back, because it's ours. It belongs to us. The government doesn't own this nation. We do. And my point is, saying that I'm not violent and everything, well, everything the terrorists did on 9/11 was morally, reprehensibly wrong, and if there is a hell, they are surely there. What they weren't wrong about is that America is not the good guy, at least from their perspective, where they came from. And sometimes it takes an outside source to show you have a problem. I think we've all had a friend that has a drinking problem, or a smoking problem, or whatever, and you love that friend, but they don't see their problem. And sometimes you just have to hit them with the truth. And it's brutal, but we need to face the facts. That the last 20 years, and even before that, America's made a lot of questionable decisions. And has made some just bad decisions. And by that I mean they cost lives. Our citizens' lives. Other humans' lives, which are equally valuable around the world. For either no gain at all, or even worse, for fucking corporate dollars. And that is sick. The reason that this nation is rotten to the core, on the government level, is just how insipid and insidious these gargantuan American companies have become. And some of them aren't even really American anymore. They're international. They're American when it suits them, but they're some other port when it comes time to pay taxes. They suck this country dry. They don't pay their fair share of taxes. They treat their employees, American citizens, like shit. Or they just lay them off entirely. We've let it go too far. And that's why there's only one answer to fix all this. Only one man can do it. Zombie Teddy Roosevelt. So, on November 3rd, I implore you to vote for Zombie Teddy Roosevelt. Let's bust some trust. Let's crack some monopolies. Let's get small business back going where it needs to be. Let's get everyone paying their fair share of taxes. Let's cut the federal government. Let's do all that. Let's cut back on military spending and either just use that to cut back on taxes, or at the very least pay for things that we need, like new roads and infrastructure that's sorely lacking, at least in some states. So vote Zombie Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah, just my thoughts. Maybe it would be easier if I just hated America, but I don't. But it does hurt me to see all the problems and how unwilling people seem to be, government seems to be, to make changes. As I said, I got my first guide dog in New York in '99. I got my second one, Prince, in 2004. Being up there after the attacks, not immediately after, but just a couple of years, because it was early 2004. It was interesting to see the differences and also how people were determined to not let it get them down. And that was very admirable. And I have to, when people talk about New Yorkers, I think maybe they forget today how strong they were. What a sense of community they showed. The firefighters, the EMTs, the police, and other first responders that risked their lives. Many of them dying that day, many more dying in days and weeks and years to come afterwards, just on the slim chance of saving people's lives in the rubble. And how as a community, and you wouldn't think a city that huge could feel like a community, but it did, how they had that spirit. So I guess at the end of the day, politics and all that aside up in New York, that's my memories of those people and how they drew together. And just how admirable it truly was. Well, guys, I think I'll call it a day. So, those of you who were adults during 9/11, how was it for you? And honestly, even more interesting to me, those of you who were young, say, before puberty, before teenage years when it happened, or even some of you, maybe not even born yet when it happened, or very young. What's your take on it? This thing that for some of us was a part of our lives, for you is a thing in the history books. Much like the end of the Vietnam War was for me, because it happened a few years before my birth, that kind of thing. I'm very curious. I think on this day I just felt like doing something kind of thoughts and whatnot. Trying to be respectful of everything, because that's truly how I feel. But with that said, definitely remember to vote for Zombie Teddy Roosevelt on November 3rd, 2020.